Okay, so you should be able to see, thank you, Emma, a presentation from me. And Emma did a great job at introducing me, but I thought I probably needed to do a brief introduction to myself as well. So I'm a geographer, which is possibly quite an unusual person to come and be talking to a group who are involved in patient and public involvement in science. But for me, really, it means I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist. So I'm interested in all different aspects of a challenge or a set of issues. And I work across academic and policy communities. So for a while, I was a member of the UK Animals and Science Committee, where I chaired the UK review of harm-benefit analysis. And as part of that, I became very interested not only in the work that was being done to address harms around animal research, but also who was speaking for benefits in animal research. And this led me to a body of work on patient involvement and engagement. So this body of work sits within a broader collaborative project, which is the Animal Research Nexus programme. We're a mix of historians, geographers, sociologists, and public engagement practitioners, sometimes with different views, but with a shared interest in the social relationships around animal research. So Nexus for us is this mix of the formal regulatory requirements, the things that people are required to do, but then also the more informal, changing social processes through which people do them. So, for example, harm-benefit analysis is something that is required in the UK by law, but patient involvement often isn't. But those two are increasingly coming together. And that's what we looked at the University of Exeter. How is patient and public involvement in biomedical research changing practices around animal research? And what I want to go through with you today is a little bit about the context for the study, a little bit about the voices. Really, I decided as we were talking about PPI, I wanted to showcase the voices of some of the people who were involved in these conversations and to give them a little bit of a context, so mapping the current conversations. And then I want to introduce a little bit about how we, from our work, saw meaningful involvement around this quite complex interface moving forward. What I would like to say at the beginning is this work would not have been possible without my colleagues Rich Gorman and Gabrielle King, both of whom worked with me at different points on this project and have contributed an incredible amount to it. So the first part of this is what were we doing studying patient involvement with animal research? And a little bit about terminology here. Obviously, as a network, you probably know this is an area where terminology is often quite complex and contested. Many people we've worked with have preferred terms, and the one that's come up a lot is people affected by health conditions within the PPI community. Patients, I would say, is often not their preferred vocabulary. However, we have found that this is the one that moves most easily between the worlds of PPI and animal research. So with a slight caveat, this is the term that we've decided to use in our work. It's also worth noting that we're focusing on involvement. There's obviously a difference here between involvement and engagement. Involvement in research tends to refer to research carried out in active partnership, doing research with people rather than to or for them, whereas engagement we see much more as being about sharing knowledge and information, which can be targeted at specific patient groups, of course. We focused, our aim is to think with and build capacity for patient involvement, but that often also involves engagement. So what are we talking about specifically? We began to be interested in the growing number of events where patients and publics were encountering animal research. And these are a list of some of the things that we were looking at. There are patient open days and tours at research facilities like MRC Harwell, which is seen in the poster on the left here. There's a lot of patient and public involvement via lay review, where people sit on panels and they're helping medical charities particularly develop priorities in partnership with the people affected by their research. There are some quite specific things around in the animal research community. For example, the discovery of a new animal model can mobilize a patient community or advocacy group. And then there's a lot of media representations of patient and researcher experiences, whether that's in an animal facility or a charity website. And we were also looking at those. And as you can see at this stage, it's a complex and diverse field. And it's located at the intersection of two quite challenging topics: patient involvement with preclinical research, where you may have a much more difficult pathway to track between the kinds of decisions that are being made at the research and then the outcomes for patients. And there may be additional issues of terminology and that sort of thing that actually make even just this element of patient involvement with preclinical research quite complex. Then you add into that the kind of history and the ethical and emotional complexities of talking about animal research, and you end up with something that's really quite a challenging field to work in, but nevertheless also quite an important one and a growing one. So we were interested in learning from the experiences that people had and understanding what motivated them to get involved in this quite complex field, so that we could learn and help people navigate through it a little bit more effectively. And the first thing that we found is that there are many different expectations around the role that patients might play when it comes to biomedical and animal research. These include translation gaps, where there's an expectation that patient involvement may be able to reshape research practices to better deliver clinical outcomes. There are accountability issues, and this particularly comes from the funders, where they want patient involvement to add legitimacy to the kinds of decisions they're making and the way they're using their funding. And then there are also these, what we might call these public understanding deficits, where patients are expected to provide support for animal research in a pro and anti-public debate. So you can see, if you're getting involved in animal research as a patient, you don't know when you're coming to this event what is being expected of you. And sometimes these imperatives can be slightly in contradiction. For example, if you wanted to provide a research challenge to better enhance translation, that might not be the same as providing public support for animal research. So there's some complex dynamics here which people get inserted into, and we wanted to understand how people navigated these. So just quite briefly, this is what we did. We mapped a range of PPI activities around animal research over a period of about 3 or 4 years, looked at policy literature, took part in patient open days and other events, and we sent out some recruitment questionnaire surveys to both the patient participants on research networks, but also scientists. And we followed those up with more in-depth individual interviews with patient representatives, with PPI practitioners and funders, and with scientists and other biomedical researchers. And then we sought to bring all of these different voices together through 2 stakeholder workshops, one focusing on all of the lay people that we've been talking to. So we looked at trying to develop some conversations between lay people sitting on PPI panels and lay people sitting on the animal welfare and ethical review boards to see what they might have in common. And then we tried to build a further workshop where everybody came together. And all the way through, we've developed our analysis and our reporting in consultation with our research participants as well. And you can follow the link if you want to see a little bit more about what we've been publishing. So I'm going to provide you with a little snapshot of some of our results. And as I said before, I've decided to focus on the voices of the people who are doing this work, because I think sharing them can be a good way to stimulate conversation. There might be positions in there that you recognise, or there might be positions in there that you want to challenge, but I think it's interesting to see how they speak from different positions and sometimes how they talk past each other. So what I want to do is I want to start with a little bit of a snapshot of the scientist's view. So these are scientists responding to our recruitment questionnaire, so we did follow up interviews with quite a few of these people, but we asked one question: do research scientists see being involved in animal research as a particular barrier to patient and public involvement? And as you can see there was roughly, I mean not quite, but roughly a 50-50 split. Unsure and yes, it was a barrier, and then no, it wasn't a barrier, roughly split down the middle. And then we asked why, and you can see there some of the things that people said. Many of them assume quite a lot about the public. So you get an assumption that the public is somehow in a deficit of understanding. So public are not understanding, they're not keen on the idea, they don't want to know about the specifics, they don't understand the necessity. And you can see from this is where this kind of education role for involvement comes from. Sometimes this becomes a much more of a public hostility. People were worried about negative perceptions. They saw animal research as heavily stigmatized. They didn't seem to understand that it was a necessity unless they were patients. So you can see again how patients begin to become enrolled in involvement, which is meant to be for their benefit, for a slightly different purpose. It moves through. There are other people who were talking about this as raising public awareness. So bringing patients and publics into facilities creates a better awareness of what they were doing. There were much fewer people who really moved towards what you might see as the more traditional expectation of patient involvement, that it is actually about co-production or viewing patients and publics as stakeholders. So somebody says there, patients and the public as stakeholders in the research. And then the last one is kind of interesting. It suggests that rather than assuming things, you actually need to set up a process where people can learn. So they sort of suggest there's a shift. The public perception of animal research means it may be necessary to prepare people for what they may see. However, it's possible to do this and to benefit all concerned. So we begin to see here the understanding that there's a process of learning, and that is probably mutual learning that needs to go on in order to get to a point where it is possible to do meaningful patient and public involvement. But these assumptions really struck us, and they came up again and again. So I've just been writing a book chapter for a book that we've got coming out that pulls together all of the different work that we've been doing across the Animal Research Nexus project. And we decided to focus on the assumptions that people had that we thought were a barrier to doing meaningful patient and public involvement. And I'm just going to run you through 4 of those before moving on to some more practical suggestions. And these 4 assumptions I think are interesting because they allow us to hear the voices of those people who are already taking part in these activities. So the first assumption that we heard again and again was that patients don't want to know about animal research. And like all of these assumptions, there is always an element of truth in them. You will find that there are some people who don't want to know. But the people we spoke to wanted to have the opportunity to choose the right information for them, highlighting the importance of not assuming that they didn't want to know. So to clarify here, we're talking about people who are already involved in PPI. So they are reviewing research proposals, they're commenting on lay summaries, they may be involved in visiting research facilities or even mentoring research staff. And in that case, they really did want to know what was happening to the animals because they felt that they had some responsibility for them through the process of involvement. So you have one of the quotes here from Tabitha saying, I do like to know the detail. I really want to know they're being treated humanely and any suffering is minimised. I do want to know that. I don't want to have my brain working overtime thinking I've just given something a high score for research. So this would be reviewing an application. And I don't understand what the animals have to go through. I think it would be good if we had more of these conversations. Reducing that anxiety would be a huge help to me personally in reducing the guilt. And then you've got another one that suggests that these people were already thinking about themselves as having potential bodily, or what we would call corporeal, connections to the research as well. So Tristan says there, as patients, we've all been, I hate to use the word, we've all been in some way a guinea pig. So it's a cliche, but we've been analogous to the mouse in a specific situation. So again, they want to have a knowledge and a conversation because they often already are thinking about these things. Thinking about them may be hard, but as Tabitha says, not having the conversation is actually something that causes anxiety. The second assumption that we came across was that patients will always support animal research. And again, like many of the points, this assumption contains another important element of truth, but it's not a simple position. So some did talk about the fact that illness had changed or strengthened their perspectives on animal research. As Tim says, when you get an illness like this, I don't know, but I imagine people who get chronic illnesses will be far more supportive of animal research in relation to research on that illness. But then others brought their views on animal research into the conversations they were having as a patient involvement representative in different ways. This was particularly in the case with disease areas where there'd been really uncertain progress in mice, like dementia. So some, like Tina, had been involved in research on a particular condition for a while, and they'd come to see the same models being put forward by different researchers again and again. Now, we all may know these are the animal models that may secure a journal publication. They're the ones that are used as the kind of gold standard in the field. But as Tina says, she began to question quite avidly, why would a mouse model be useful in this particular situation? Why can't researchers be looking for an alternative model? And this is partly from her experience, but also partly from her own position. And that's the feedback she might give. She says, because as a general principle, I'd like to see less animal research. So people are coming to research involvement with a range of personal experiences. And some of what the work we've been doing is to try and help those people who organise PPI events to get the right balance between ensuring that you're creating a safe environment for conversations to happen, but not excluding these perhaps more critically supportive views. So Tina might have a very useful voice here because of her experience, but oftentimes there's a tendency to think that if somebody's critical of animal research, they need to be almost screened out of some of these PPI conversations. And it's a tricky balance, absolutely, to get that safe but also constructively critical conversation going. And we've been doing a little bit of work on that. Assumption number 3 is that patients don't have relevant expertise. And what we hope, and maybe I don't need to make this case to a PPI network, but people bring diverse, that should be experience, not experiments. People bring diverse experience to involvement, and careful planning can ensure that it's valued and made relevant, even in these more upstream and contentious issues. And in the work that we've done, there were probably 3 main ways in which people stress the relevance of their expertise, which could be used to form involvement. First, those involved in research felt their lived experiences of health could and should be taken into account when deciding the priority issues for research. As the second part of Rachel's quote at the top there says, we can add value by looking at it through the eyes of people living with dementia. Do we see it as a priority? How would that impact us? The first part of Rachel's quote there also shows another element, is that people accrue expertise through their involvement, particularly their involvement in biomedical research. So she talks about having got enough experience to be able to go and make meaningful contributions, built up over quite a long period of time of involvement. And then thirdly, while we use the word patient involvement, it's important to recognise that people bring diverse expertise beyond their embodied experiences of health. And many people that we talk to mentioned how their careers had given them the skills that they used in their involvement role, and that included project planning and management, training and development, and all sorts of things which could help realise the benefits from research. And Raymond says here, one of the most important things is that volunteers are rarely recognised as having skills and experience that could be of consequence in their new environment. Volunteers are not just bodies to be used, but people with all sorts of skills who can actually help the organisation. Final assumption that I want to run through is this assumption that patients will not make a difference. Now, this relates to the really quite tricky question of evaluation. It's really hard to evaluate the impact of patient involvement in preclinical research. Rosalind, who's an involvement professional, puts it very well. It's more challenging than clinical research. The role of the patient, carer, consumer, whatever term you want to use, is quite well laid out now with regards to clinical research. I think it's a little less clear when it comes to animal research, what role consumers can play and the value of the contribution they can make. So yes, I do think it's more difficult. And there are a number of different elements to this. One is, what are we actually evaluating? Are we evaluating the outcome of an individual experiment? In that case, because this research is what you might call upstream, it can be really quite tricky to identify the impact that patient involvement has had. However, if you start looking at some of the organizational transformations, some of the relationships that are built, some of the questions of motivation and purpose for scientists, as well as for patients who are involved, you begin to see that evaluation could be expanded to include a much wider set of things that are important to people. So as Tabitha says, I think another upside of patient involvement is that it gives you a purpose, it gives you some feeling of value, and that you do still have a value. And we've also heard that story from researchers themselves, that what they most value in the work that they do is the contact they have with patients. It's the thing that keeps them motivated, but it's the thing that we find challenging to evaluate. So this is probably something that you need to think about, how it connects up to the way that organizations reward or provide credit within scientific careers and other kinds of activities that they support. As I've said, they're evaluating the outcomes from patient involvement is important, but what is valued is complex, including both research impacts and also these changing and supportive relationships. So that's kind of a little bit of a snapshot of some of the voices of the people that are doing this and what they think about what they're doing and some of the complexities of it. What we've then done is we've tried to condense all of this material into a report, which we hope is a condensation of resources and reflections, and it's something that people can take away and use and be guided by in their work. So in the sort of closing few minutes, what I wanted to do is just introduce this report, excuse me, that we've put together recently. It's available on our website, and I've just selected a few snapshots from it, and I can answer any questions about it. I'm just going to grab a bit of water. So this is a report that we've put together that came out earlier this year, and it's got an introduction where it introduces our research, but it's then organised in 5 main sections. And what we do in these sections is we try and put together resources that are already out there. So there's already a lot of published material on patient involvement. There's already a lot of published material on animal research. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to direct people to what exists already and connect these conversations up. Because as I hope I've shown you, there's a lot of potential here, but there's also some sense at the moment that not all of the conversations that need to be connected up actually are connected up. So in organising the report, we've made it, we hope, really quite straightforward. So it moves through from the kind of basic, how do you open up a conversation about animal research, through where these conversations might take place, to more detailed questions around talking about animal models or considering ethical review, and then continuing a conversation around involvement, which we think needs a lot of organisational support. And then within each of these sections, we present some of the perspectives of the patients who are involved, the scientists and the PPI professionals. And then we try and bring it together at the end. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the content of some of this. Apologies in advance if the text is a little bit small, but I hope you can at least see the box there. So this is the opening kind of substantive chapter of this report. And here you've got a section on what it might mean to open up a conversation and start a conversation about animal research. And we point to the fact that there are already some resources there in terms of the Concordat on openness on animal research. And we explore what that provides, but also some of the limits of that. And what you'll find in each of them is a set of reflections from our research. So we were asked all the way through doing this research, could we provide some case studies? Now, social science research tends to work with people with the offer of anonymity. So very sadly, we've not been able to provide those kind of concrete case studies that say this person at this institution was doing this work. We've tried to summarize instead the kind of key messages that we think come out of those case studies. So this section for research scientists would point you to the different places in your organisation where you might have initial support for helping you to have a conversation with the public or patients about animal research. And it would point you to your involvement and engagement officer, perhaps the named information officer under ASPA if you were working in the UK, the press office, but also colleagues in research charities. These are often not connected up, and they will perhaps have some of those different expectations that I outlined earlier about what you are doing when you're talking to patients. So we've included some suggestions about how you connect these up by clarifying what it is you want this conversation to do. But we've also included, for example, this anecdote from Rob, a senior research scientist at a university who found asking questions helped him to involve people in research. So he asked a support group of people affected by a condition if he could send them documents about his research to share out and to give feedback. He explained what he thought was important in understanding the progression of the disease, how he'd been thinking about disseminating the data, and asked an open question about what they thought. They came back with comments on the complexity of the lay summary, but supported the research question. And they also challenged him to think differently about disseminating the data to include drug companies that played an important role for them in the disease community. So you can see this was really formulated as an exchange of views that came out of one opening conversation. Further on in the report, as I said, we dive into a few more details. So we've got a chapter about animal models, trying to explain what they are, that would guide people who are involved in research to understand what an animal model is. And then also to get them to think about how they can relate their expertise to the kinds of things they might be asked to review about animal models when they get a research proposal in front of them. So we've got some really quite practical advice in there that would tell somebody or suggest that somebody affected by a health condition who's asked to review a research proposal involving an animal model might want to have some certain questions in mind about the relevance of that animal model. And they are things we, from our research, think that people are already asking, but writing it down there, I think, is helpful to pull it together, but also to show scientists that these are the kinds of things that people affected by health conditions might want to ask. So if you're looking at a research proposal and you want to think about the relevance of an animal model as somebody who's has experience of that disease, you might want to think about how effectively does the research proposal explain why that model is being used and not another one? Are they clear how they're using an animal model to understand the human condition? And that might help you to make a judgment about whether that's the most important aspect of that condition to you. How many people affected by a health condition is a specific animal model relevant for? Does the experiment seem to be using the animal model to focus on the health aspects most relevant to you and others? And what other kinds of models, animals or non-animal, have they considered when selecting this as the best? Just really practical things that are intended to give people confidence in having a conversation, simply. And by putting it there, we're also showing that scientists may want to think about these questions as well when they're addressing the kinds of communications that they're having to patient communities. And these are, at this point, quite expert patient communities. And then final extract from the report that I'm going to show you is a little bit about connecting the different processes. And this is some of our advice for those people who are organising patient and public involvement activities. So one of the things that came up quite a lot is the confusion between a project review and an ethical review, which are two different processes. So we explain this for everybody concerned. And then we also want to make it quite clear that there are different processes and different roles and responsibilities. This is kind of going back to my point of showing the patients who were worrying about their responsibility for the health and welfare of the animals. So we wanted to make it really clear that there are different kinds of reviews. There's a project review, there's also an ethical review. So you as a patient representative are not ultimately making that ethical review. You don't have to feel that you're responsible in that way, but you can still make a meaningful contribution to this process. And simply that's just showing people that there are different forms of review and how their perspective fits into the broader picture. And we've got some advice for the engagement involvement practitioners who might be organising these to do really great straightforward things, that they need to acknowledge the range of views that may be present, offering opportunities for people affected by health conditions to find out the information that matters for them, ensuring that people don't feel responsible for the outcomes of the ethical review, and at the same time, and this kind of goes back to my initial point that I became interested in this because of my work on harm-benefit analysis, that enhancing benefits is also a contribution to an ethical assessment. So we have Sabrina there, who's involved in an engagement practitioner from a medical research charity, talking about that this is something that they are now addressing in training, wanting people to be aware of the ethical issues and form their own opinions and not be afraid to discuss what those opinions are, provide a safe place and opportunity to respect each other's opinions and create discussion and dialogue around it. So there's lots and lots in the report, which I hope is practical and useful. Academics, social scientists aren't always the best at doing the kind of practical reports, but we've sort of enjoyed working enormously with members of the Shared Learning Group in the UK and also members of people who I've worked with on the Animals and Science Committee to get their input into the final version of this report. So we really do hope that there's some practical recommendations in there for what we really do recognise as a challenging conversation, but one that we think is an important conversation to be had to sort of move towards ensuring that when involvement around animal research does happen, it happens in a way that's meaningful and appropriate, particularly for the patients who are involved in it. So that's it. That's sort of the end of what I wanted to talk through in terms of the presentation. Just final thanks to the Wellcome Trust who funded this, everybody who's taken part and collaborated in it. And thank you for listening as well.